I'm going to drop the link for the solution in our chat here and take it away.
Sweet. So what Lem is sharing right now is one of our Mapbox solutions. Solutions are essentially a blueprint for how to quickly get running with Mapbox tools. And this one is no coding experience needed kind of solution, right? You can get started. A lot of our customers in journalism, for example, have jumped right into this, been able to create a story from scratch. The one that we're actually going to build together today combines a couple different types of data layers. So you'll see we have some data-driven styling where these circles here represent attendance numbers at the Smithsonian museums. I was actually surprised to learn that the National Museum of Natural History was the most attended Smithsonian in 2019. But this is supposed to really highlight how diverse the data can be that you're trying to bring to the user's attention. You can embed images. You can have 3D extrusions of shapes on your map. And all of these animations, these camera angle changes are all built into this solution. So you can see my last layer here, my last chapter of this story has a line layer that faded in to show the path around the mall that you could take to visit all of these places. So that's what we're going to be building together today.
And Steven, you can use basically any map layer, any custom map or any stock map from Mapbox for that, right?
Exactly. So you might notice this looks like a pretty generalized map, but I did intentionally create this custom map style in Mapbox Studio. I took away a lot of the labels that are usually there, like points of interest, just to focus the user's attention on the base layout of the National Mall area. I highlighted metro stops, public transit, because that's really helpful when you're navigating around downtown DC. And this could be any custom style that you make within Mapbox. You could bring in satellite imagery even, right? There's a lot of flexibility in that. So to get started, I'm back at that interactive storytelling solution page. I'm just going to hit start building. This is about halfway down the page. And you'll see this takes us over to a GitHub repository. Basically, this is just a bunch of folders of code and other documents. So I'm going to actually download this repository. So you'll see if you click on the clone or download button over here on the right in GitHub, it gives the option to download as a zip folder. That's what we're going to do here. And that should have dropped right into my downloads folder. You can see I already downloaded it earlier today when I was testing things out. So this is, once I pop open the zipped folder, this is what we have inside. You'll see we have a couple of folders and a couple of files. We're going to go into the SRC or source folder first, and then vanilla.js. So this is vanilla JavaScript. And then these are all the files that you're going to need to get started making this project. Remember, this is the example that we're going to be recreating today. Mapbox engineers have written all the code that makes this work. You'll see we just have to drop in the content for our story. So we need things like the titles, the text that appears in each of these chapters. We're going to need to set up the camera angles, but you have all the tools to do that right in this vanilla.js folder. I want to pause for a second. Any questions in the chat about where we got to so far, Lem?
No questions at this moment. You're saying everything, so everything that you're editing is in that source folder.
Yep.
But you're touching on not HTML in this example, right?
Right. So we're actually, the HTML file, we won't have to do anything with. We're going to have what's called a config or configuration file that we set up.
Okay.
So no coding. It's just kind of filling in the details of what we want to view on our map. So with that in mind, I'll open these items up in a code editor. So this is just a text editor, right? This could be Notepad. This could be, I use Visual Studio Code. There's a lot of other editors out there like Atom. this is, just somewhere that you can actually see what's in those files. So let me open those in code. You can see.
Stephen Dom asks about the 3D buildings that you have on the map. How did you get those individual buildings on the map? Because you can do basically the whole city or the whole world in Mapbox. How'd you limit it to just certain buildings?
Oh, that's a great question. So in my Mapbox style that I created in Studio, I used the datasets editor and drew shapes. So I just essentially went in, traced those, drew the kind of polygons that outlined the footprint of the building, and then I extruded each of those using a 3D layer type, 3D extrusion.
And so you added a part of the data that you added in there was like a height or fill layer, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I brought in I have a couple data sets that are built into my style. So I have the data that shows what the attendance numbers were.
Mm-hmm.
I have the shapes that outline these buildings and a height that's associated with them.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also have a line inside of my data set that shows up at the end of our story. So it's just lines and shapes and points with values associated with them.
And so if you wanted, you could have made the height of the buildings relative to the number of their attendance, right?
Yeah, that would be a really cool data-driven styling example. So I have just some hard-coded and just some values that I typed in to get these heights to render, but it could be dependent on the data that's underneath the shape if you really want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
It's really flexible. We have a lot of great tutorials about how to use Mapbox Studio, and we can drop some links to those in the chat as well. So I have those files that were from our vanilla.js folder. So first, I'm going to lightly touch on the index.html file here. We're not actually going to have to change anything in here, but if you were to open it up, you'll just see it's basically a lot of HTML and CSS and JavaScript that takes care of the logic that you won't have to worry about, which is pretty great. So what we're actually going to be most involved with is this config.js.template file. So if you open up this file, you'll see some details here that start to describe what's going to be visualized on our scrollytelling map. So we need to define a style. So this is something that you can get back from Mapbox Studio. We can start off with Mapbox Streets, but we're going to replace it with a custom style that I created, the one that has these 3D buildings, these other data layers. You'll see it that there isn't too much customization on it at first glance until you zoom in. Then I'm going to need to drop in an access token. So this is just the token that you need to pull all the map data from Mapbox. And that's just in your free Mapbox account. And then we'll start customizing more. So I already have some context to start adding into here. Lem, were you able to drop the storyline.txt link into the chat?
I've not yet. Let me
good.
Go ahead and do that.
Yeah. So all this storyline.txt file contains is just what I want to kind of infuse into this story. So you'll see I have my access token and my style, custom style that I'm going to copy over. You can actually do this on your computer too. I made sure that these were all public. And then I started outlining my story. If you're in journalism or on a content team or just doing this for fun, you want to start laying out and think about it's like writing a book, right? You want to plan out chapter by chapter what you want to present to the reader or viewer. So I kind of broke up each chapter of my story into a title and then kind of the description. And then there's a few more details that I'll dig into that adjust how the camera moves around and how the data appears. So you'll see our first chapter is about the National Mall, and it has my little blurb about checking out all the Smithsonian museums, you'll see that that's exactly what appears up over here in our example. So now let's go ahead and drop in those first couple details from our storyline.txt file. Copying in that access token first. So this is something that you'll need to actually pull from your Mapbox account if you want your story to keep working after today. I'm gonna have to reset this one so that it doesn't get overused by too many folks, but you can get started for free. You have a pretty generous free tier on Mapbox. Is that what you were thinking about, Lem?
Yeah, I was just saying everyone should be able to log into Studio and grab their access token and any map style they want. Stephen, we've got two questions about 3D objects and styles. First is, could 3D buildings be inserted from a SketchUp file?
That's a great question. So there are ways to transform 3D file types into a format that works on mapbox.com. I definitely think that's an example that we'd want to dig into further with you. So I'd say feel free to reach out to Lem and I, and we can connect with you after this and help walk you through that.
Then Dom also wanted to know, if you have your own 3D object, can you add it to the map using a custom layer?
Yeah, totally. We have great examples in the Mapbox documentation online. It's definitely possible to bring in like 3D objects. I think the example on the Mapbox website has like a satellite dish, right? It's a very complex 3D shape, but there are ways, yeah, to bring that right into your map. Cool. So now that I've updated the style and the access token, I'm actually gonna open my HTML file in my browser. So all right, let's see, live debugging.
So Stephen, if people wanted to kind of share these online, maybe if they're collaborating with someone, is there a resource or a website you would use to do that?
Sorry, collaborating on what, Len?
With someone on creating their own story, right?
Yeah.
Is there a website that would be easy to recommend, either CodePen or something similar, to drop their files in and work on together?
Yeah, I like CodePen, and there are a number of others that are actually out there that do a very similar thing where you can drop in your HTML file in your JavaScript and it'll just render the page right next to it. CodePen.io is the one that I would recommend for collaborating on something like this. So I realized what was wrong. So I forgot to rename this template file. It should just be config.js rather than config.js.template. It's there to help set us up with all the tools that we need. But then when we actually need to load our story, you'll see that we need to change the title of that file, and then it'll load properly.
And a lot of these instructions, I know Steve and I are kind of just working through and talking through things today. A lot of the instructions are located in the README of the repo in GitHub as well.
Right.
So I know the first time I used it, I kind of just did it side by side, going sort of step one, step two, and making the changes on my files directly. So we've done, I think our team's done a really good job of trying to document that so it's easy for you to use.
Yeah. So now we can see that our page is rendering. And that's our first step. We also, you can notice that everything needs to initialize still. So let's see. It thinks all the lorem ipsum, all the placeholder text is a different language. So I'm just double checking some settings here. what I'm going to do first, we're going to go into our config file. Okay, here we go. I had updated the file before I renamed it, so it didn't have the access token that I needed. So let me open up that gist again.
I think most people could probably identify with being in a very similar place. Sometimes moving too fast or forgetting to save or rename a file before you try to make it work. It's hard.
Yeah. Right. This is a common coding experience, right? But once we refresh, we'll see that I properly am, referencing the style that was from my custom style and the access token that's needed to get the map from Mapbox, essentially. So looking at the template that we start with, we notice that it has some placeholder text and some placeholder locations. So that's what we're going to start updating next. You can see from this angle, the 3D buildings from my custom style are starting to fade in, and some of the base map looks familiar from that example we were just looking at over here. But now we have to start updating each chapter of the story to represent what we want to tell. So first, we're going to jump into...
Steven, what are the chapters exactly?
What are the chapters?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a great question. So it's essentially each step of our story. When you're going through this scrollytelling experience, each of these blocks that you see is kind of a visual representation of a chapter. So it might incorporate an image, right? It might change the camera angle on the map. And this allows you to very deliberately direct the user's attention as they're going through this experience.
Yeah. And you can include videos, you can include GIFs, images, whatever sort of static file that you want to include there. We were seeing some examples today. One of the first ones I shared is they have charts in GIF format that help give you a little bit more additional context to what they're showing you.
Right. The Al Jazeera example is another one that highlights how diverse, right, the extra context can be that you provide for each chapter. But at the end of the day, right, it's all focused around helping the user understand where is this information taking place. So I'm going to come back over and start setting up the first chapter back in our config file. So we set the style to the custom style I shared, and then we added an access token. And now we can see there's some parameters for the story overall. So I'm just going to change a few of these. The title, we'll see it update in our tab when I save and refresh over here. I'm going to drop the subtitle from the overall story. So it'll update this title, this subtitle, and you'll see we also have the byline. By a digital storyteller is the default. So you can say, Stephen and Lem today. And when you scroll all the way to the bottom, you can add a footer in case you want to include sources. That's especially helpful, if you do interviews or collect your data from public resources. I'm actually just going to remove the footer in this example, but that's where it would appear. And I'll save, refresh. You can see those attributes for like the overall story have been updated. Similarly, we're going to start going in and editing the chapters of the story. So from the story I had written up separately, I'm going to take the first title, copy this in. I'm going to copy the description here. Make sure that I place that properly, and then also wrap all my text so it's a little more legible there. We're not scrolling, horizontally scrolling so much. And then finally, you'll see that I already prepared the location of where the camera should be on the map. Now, when I mentioned earlier that you should have all the tools that you need right in that vanilla.js folder, let's jump back to there. We have this HTML file called helper.html. If we open up this up in our browser, this is our what we call our location helper tool. So it gives you a map that you can move around. If you want to adjust the view of the map, you have some tools here to zoom in and out. You can scroll also to zoom in and out. You have the zoom in, zoom out buttons.
You can also adjust the pitch, right, and the tilt on the map.
Exactly. So if you want to adjust the tilt and the pitch, you essentially click on these arrows, drag up or down, and you can kind of turn it if you want to adjust the angle of what's visual north on your map. So I want to start in DC. I've disoriented myself. So if you tap on this, the bearing and pitch tool, if you just tap on it, it actually will reset to what you'd expect to see.
Move your window over to the center of the screen a little bit more so we can see the buttons in the top right corner.
Yeah.
That you're referring to, just to make sure we're...
Yeah, good call out. Thanks, Len. So this is the bearing tool that I'm talking about. So if you were to change how the map looks, what angle you're viewing at, if you tap on that, if you click on that, it'll help reset you. And then I'm just clicking and dragging to reset to this kind of top-down view that you're used to seeing on most maps. So what I did to get this location information in my storyline for each chapter, you'll see I have a center, which is the latitude and longitude that you're centered on, the zoom level, how far out or close to the ground you are, and then a pitch and a bearing that talk about that tilt adjustment. You'll see if you just use your helper tool, we automatically generate these values for you. Again, I just got to that by opening up this helper.html file in the folder that we already downloaded. And then I adjusted the map to where I wanted to visualize and then copied those values.
And you can also just use our geocoder in the corner to search, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. Up here in the top right, you'll notice there's a little search bar. So if you wanted to get to anywhere else in the world pretty quickly, you can start searching for it. The map will take you over there, and that quickly, you can be in a new place to readjust the map however you want. Cool. Any questions about that in the chat, Len?
No, we look good. Keep rocking.
Keep rolling. Nice. So now that we know how to get our location information, I'm going to copy that into our config file. So remember, we added the title, we updated the description. I don't want an image in my first chapter, so it's as simple as removing that. But I'll show you in the next chapter how to do that, how to add an image. And then the location information I copied in from the storyline file. Remember, we were just getting this location information from our position helper tool. So that was a quick recap of how we've adjusted for the first chapter so far. I'll touch on the chapter enter and exit pieces in a second, but let's save that and see what this all looks like now that that's been updated. So I just came back to the same version of this file in my browser. Did I save the... Oh, I didn't update the location. Just notice the latitude and longitude are off by a bit. So I'm just copying them from here or from my location helper. updating, saving the config file, and then refreshing. So now we can see the text, the content was brought in, and we have that starting angle that we had in the preview. Oh, I adjusted it a little bit, it looks like. But if you copy right from the storyline.txt file, this should be what you're starting with. Now we can talk a little bit about the on chapter enter and on chapter exit parameters here.
Oh, wait.
Oh.
That is
question.
I love the on chapter enter and exit. I really want you to talk about that. But I see somebody saying, yo, what's the storyline txt file? Because you just made that one up. It's not part of the template. You should probably explain it.
Totally.
Yeah.
Lem, could you mind dropping that in the chat again, Lem?
Yep, I just dropped it back in the chat. This is a sort of a standalone piece to the separate from the actual solution. This is Steven's text file that he's using to create the solution for us today. So all the content in between. Yeah, this kind of framing is helpful to get all of your ideas for the story that you want to tell in one place. This is just a text file I wrote up. I had this idea in my head. I could visualize the whole mall. I could highlight the Smithsonian museums, and then I could highlight maybe specific locations along the mall. So as I was literally writing my story, I came up with titles for each chapter, a little description to appear, and then I used the position helper tool to figure out, what's the best camera angle to tell this chapter of the story. So you'll see each chapter, I have a different title, description text, camera angle. These are all things that when you're creating a story, right, when you're telling or writing a story somewhere else, you do have to logically lay out, what do I tell first, then second and third, and so on. This is the same thing, me just writing down my thoughts in a way that's going to be easy to copy and paste into the template. Yeah, that's a really good workflow, Stephen, to have that information sort of set aside so you're not trying to build both things in tandem. Right.
There's so much that you want to get across when you're telling your story. It's easy to get caught up in, oh wait, did I paste this in the right place? Let me add the next chapter. Did I place it in the right place? Right. You want to come up with the content probably before. Right? Think about the story you want to tell, start to finish.
Stephen, I've got a question in the chat about, can I change the map style, or can I have different map styles in one story?
That's a great question. So this solution right now is built for one style, but a style can contain a lot of different data layers. This flexibility can get really complex. If you have an idea, reach out to me and Len. We'd be happy to break down, and show you how you can combine multiple layers into a single story. Cool. So now that I have my title, my description, and my location, we'll see here these on chapter enter and exit pieces of data. So what this really describes is when you want to transition a layer from being visible to not visible, or maybe you want to change another aspect about it, the layer, maybe you want to change the color of the data that's visible. This is a good way to do that as you're transitioning between chapters. You'll see this happens in my example. Starting from the National Mall, transitioning to the second chapter about Smithsonian museums, you'll see that that layer wasn't visible, but as soon as I get into the Smithsonian museums layer, the opacity, it's completely opaque. It goes from 0 opacity to 1. So we're going to be doing the same thing in our walkthrough, but you'll see, again, I do it when I switch over to the 3D extrusion layer with these buildings that extrude up from the ground.
Stephen, do we have to change the change what layers we're visualizing every chapter?
You don't have to. You can keep the same data visible in the map. So I think the Al Jazeera example we were talking about earlier, highlights this pretty well. Their map doesn't make a lot of transitions between chapters on the actual base map, right? It just changes the camera angle. Nothing fades in or fades out. They're just changing where they're directing the user's attention, not what they're directing the attention at, if that makes sense. So coming back to our example. So this is going to be visible later when we add our national poll. Oh, actually, let's bring this in.
And Stephen, while you're doing that, for every chapter, we do need to set the location and the pitch and all that information, correct?
Yeah, so they're
the same from chapter to chapter.
Right. So technically there are only, I think, 2 pieces of information you have to set every chapter. So you have to set the location because the camera needs to know how to view the map. And you need a unique ID. So I was just about to come back to this. Each chapter has to have a unique ID. So just like a string of text. So I'm going to call this first chapter National Mall. And this is just so that the code behind the scenes knows like which chapter are we on? Which data do I have to refer to load this into the view? All you have to know is that the ID has to be unique for each chapter, and you need a location and an ID.
Stephen, I've got a question here that should be relatively straightforward. Can we use different map projections in here? So or polar, anything like that?
That's a great question. Yeah, I'm going to admit I haven't tested with the storytelling template. My gut says that we recently put out an all-burst projection blog post, and I think it would be possible, but definitely something I would want to test.
Yeah, I think while you continue going through this and wrapping up for the first part of the story, I think, yeah, it definitely should be possible to use. You would need to do some probably reprojections of the geocoding aspect of it. So you wouldn't necessarily be able to use our helper text by default. And I'll drop a link in our chat about some of the different map projections that we have available sort of readily and what you can do with the reprojection around it as well. So it's simple.
Yeah.
Or simpler.
Good point, Lem. Thanks for sharing those. So you'll see now that I added this chapter enter value that set this layer, the National Mall path, this red layer you can see here that I have within my custom style, the opacity of 0.9, it's almost fully visible. So when I exit this chapter, the opacity for that layer will drop to 0. It'll be transparent, but this gives you a chance to switch between which data and which information is visualized in each chapter, if you want to do that. One other thing that I realized, there's this visual marker in the middle. For my story, I don't want that. For other stories, like the Al Jazeera one, right, they did want the marker in the middle. But just so everything's obvious what I'm doing here, I'm just going to change this show markers to false, because I don't necessarily want to have this marker image there. And now you can see it's disappeared after I changed that value for the whole story. So I'm going to continue going through these chapters. I'm going to bring in all the other information from my storyline.txt file. Again, I don't have an image in my Smithsonian Museums layer, but I'll have one on the Botanic Gardens, or sorry, chapter, the Smithsonian Museums chapter. I don't have an image. So I'm gonna paste it in the wrong place. I'm gonna paste this into the description here. I'm going to bring in my location and my on chapter enter and exit values. And again, you can see our team has written the code that processes all this, right, and understands how to turn this into the visual that we see on the HTML page. So there are some specific things, right? If you miss a comma here, a curly brace or square bracket there, right, it'll throw off how our code interprets the configuration. So if you ever run into an issue and you think, hey, why isn't my map loading, or why does the page look broken? Just note that, make sure it follows the format that comes in the template.
Stephen, are there any tools that you'd recommend someone use if they are sort of in that space?
So I love Visual Studio Code. Atom is another great code editor, and they have built in, so you probably already noticed different aspects of this file are colored differently. So that's what we call syntax highlighting in the coding world. And then there's a lot of these text editors, these code editors also they'll highlight this. If you're on a curly brace, a parentheses, or a square bracket, it'll highlight the start and the end for that particular bracket pair or parentheses pair. And those are useful for making sure that you have the opening and the closing. So I'm going to save that now that I've updated a unique ID, title, description, location. Yes. I'm going to make sure my second chapter got in there. All good. Okay. Awesome. So we can see when I move from the first chapter to the second chapter, we have that transition again. There's a layer in my style for visitor circles. So these green and yellow circles, and then also the labels. And it's all referencing the same data actually, which is pretty cool. When this chapter starts, it's fully opaque. It's at 1. And then when I exit out of this chapter, those will become transparent again. Let's see. I'm going to copy this chapter. So I was just making sure I had the whole thing. I'm just going to add another one in. Take information from my storyline file that I had already prepared. Update the title. Description. I'm going to actually go through and do this for the remainder of the chapters so we can move along here.
So I don't know, some of y'all may have seen Dom called out. We've got about 2 minutes left in the demo. So Stephen, move fast. But also, if anyone has any questions that they want to get in with Stephen and I, or Dom, or even John Brannigan, who's hanging out in the chat room, now would be the time to get them answered live. Otherwise, you can always reach out to us on Twitter or email us. Particularly help@Mapbox is a great tool and resource to use.
Yeah, and you don't need too much imagination here to see what I'm doing, right? Copying and pasting from this text file. So I'm just going to save this out, make sure that we have another layer in here, another chapter. It has another aspect to it. So it looks like.
Yeah, and there's no maximum number of chapters that you need to have. Or really beyond there's no minimum of chapters that you need to have. So you should feel comfortable really making that story as long as it needs to be, rather than trying to fill up the Mapbox template, right?
Yeah, exactly. It can be as long or as short as you want. I made one of my honeymoon, shared it with my family, right? All the stops that we went to. And it's really all about, right, where you're trying to direct the user's attention. You want to make sure you're getting your point across in the right way. We noticed here, I noticed a second ago, this wasn't transitioning. I thought, wow, I just pasted everything in. What was wrong? It's not making the camera transition I copied. And it's because I didn't have a unique ID. If you ever run into that, that's probably a good indicator. So I saved that out, refreshed. You can see now I have a chapter
So
with
how do we,
embedded image.
what's the best way to publish this now, Stephen?
Ooh, that's a great question, Len. So in that, let's see, did I put it in the storyline.txt file? Yeah, at the bottom of the storyline.txt file, I added a link to Netlify Drop. This is a service that I love for prototyping things. You literally drag your files onto this website and it creates like a web server for it. And it gives you a URL you can share with your friends, family, coworkers. So if you're ever prototyping out an idea, all I'm going to do here, it expects you to drop a folder of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and it'll get your website live. So I'm just going to create a folder here, drop my index.html and my config file into that folder. And then I'm going to pray that this works like it did 2 hours ago. Come on.
Stephen, can you change the width of each chapter?
When you say the width one, is that like where the text is visible? So that is stuff that's editable. And again, it's like one of those things, if you need help with that, reach out to us. We're happy to walk you through that. You'd have to dive a little bit into like the CSS and stuff. Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. I'm just trying to promote Netlify services. They're making me look bad.
Well, there's a lot of resources out there to publish things, to publish pages like this that are really basic.
Totally.
Yeah. You know, I linked to a few in the chat. You know, you can use GIFs in GitHub, Netlify, Stephen called out, even Glitch lets you host these sort of temporary sites or pages.
Yeah. I love Netlify. If you're ever working on like a web project, you know, you just literally drop your folder in with an HTML file, CSS, JavaScript, and it's up, right? Get feedback.
That was fantastic, y'all. Y'all made me really work those 2 minutes over. I was like, publish it, publish it. Thank you so much, Stephen and Lem. Yeah. And everybody have a great rest of your lunchtime.
Share your maps. Can't wait to see them.
Definitely. Please share them. Bye, everyone.
Bye.